What if the reason you keep getting chosen last has nothing to do with how much you have to offer, and everything to do with how you've been offering it? Somewhere along the way, you learned that being available, being agreeable, being endlessly patient and understanding was the way to earn a place in someone's life. You thought if you just gave enough, waited enough, proved yourself enough, eventually you would become the priority instead of the backup plan. But here's the truth nobody tells you. Value is never created through effort alone. It is created through perception. And right now, whether you realize it or not, you have been training the people around you to perceive you as optional. This is not a book about manipulation. It is not about playing games, keeping score, or pretending to be someone you're not, to trick people into wanting you. This is about something far more powerful and far more permanent, understanding the psychology of how human beings assign worth and using that understanding to become someone who is never chosen out of convenience, but chosen out of certainty. Because there is a difference between being liked and being valued. There is a difference between being someone's habit and being someone's standard. And by the end of this audiobook, you will know exactly how to shift from one to the other. We are going to explore why some people become everyone's second thought while others become impossible to walk away from. We are going to dismantle the belief systems that keep you overextending yourself for people who give you the bare minimum in return. We are going to rebuild your sense of identity from the inside out, so that your worth is no longer something you perform, but something you simply embody. This is not about becoming cold, distant, or unavailable for the sake of appearing mysterious. It is about becoming so rooted in your own value that other people's inconsistency stops being able to move you. If you have ever been left wondering why you weren't chosen, why you were kept around but never prioritized, why people seem to enjoy your presence but never fought to keep it, this is for you, not to make you bitter, not to make you guarded, but to make you undeniable. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The difference between being wanted and being chosen. There is a moment that almost everyone experiences at least once in their life. It is the moment you realize that someone enjoys your company, values your conversation, even seeks you out when they are bored, lonely, or in need of comfort. And yet, when it comes time to actually choose, to commit, to prioritize, you are not the one they pick. This is one of the most disorienting experiences a person can have, because it forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth. Being wanted and being chosen are not the same thing, and confusing the two is one of the most common ways people end up giving their best years to people who are never going to give them a real place in their life. Being wanted is passive. It requires nothing from the other person except a willingness to receive what you offer. Someone can want your attention, your energy, your body, your loyalty, your emotional labor, without ever having to reciprocate any of it. Wanting you costs them nothing. It is a feeling, and feelings are cheap because they don't require action. Being chosen, on the other hand, is active. It requires sacrifice. It requires someone to give something up, to take a risk, to prioritize you over comfort, over ego, over other options, over their own hesitation. Chosen means someone looked at the cost of having you in their life and decided you were worth paying it. Wanted means someone looked at the benefit of having you around and decided to take it for free. This distinction matters because most people spend years mistaking the first for the second. You interpret someone's attention as a sign of investment. You interpret their comfort around you as commitment. You interpret the fact that they keep coming back as proof that they value you, when in reality, they may simply be enjoying the convenience of having someone who is always there, always understanding, always willing to adjust, without ever having to earn that access. And here is the part that stings the most. The more available you make yourself, the easier it becomes for someone to want you without ever choosing you, because you have already removed every incentive they would have had to make a real decision. Think about how choice actually works in human psychology. We do not value things because they are objectively valuable. We value things because they are scarce, because they require effort to obtain, because there is a real possibility of losing them if we don't act. This is true of opportunities, of possessions, and it is devastatingly true of people. When something is guaranteed, the brain stops registering it as something worth protecting. It becomes background. It becomes furniture. This is not a flaw in human nature. It is a survival mechanism, one that evolved to help our ancestors focus their limited energy on resources that were actually at risk of disappearing. And unless you understand this mechanism, you will keep positioning yourself as the guaranteed option, the safe bet, the person who will always be there no matter what. And you will keep wondering why guaranteed things are so rarely chosen. Becoming chosen requires you to reintroduce the possibility of loss, not through manipulation, not through games, not through manufactured distance or calculated silence, but through the simple and honest fact of living a full life that does not depend on any one person's presence in it. When you have your own direction, your own standards, your own sense of purpose that exists independently of whether this particular person sticks around, you stop being a guaranteed option and you become a genuine choice. Because choosing you now means someone has to actually compete for your time and attention rather than simply consuming it. The people who are chosen are not chosen because they demanded to be. They are chosen because their absence would actually be felt. Ask yourself honestly, if you disappeared from this person's life tomorrow, would it create a genuine void? Or would it simply mean one less person available to talk to? The answer to that question tells you almost everything about where you currently stand. And more importantly, it tells you exactly what needs to change. There is another layer to this that deserves attention, because it explains why so many capable, kind, and genuinely impressive people find themselves stuck in the wanted but not chosen category for years at a time. It is the belief that if you simply demonstrate enough value, the choosing will happen automatically. You believe that if they see how good you are to them, how supportive, how understanding, how fun to be around, eventually the scale will tip and they will choose you the way you've been choosing them all along. But this belief misunderstands how choosing actually works. Choosing is not a reward that gets unlocked after enough evidence has been gathered. It is a decision someone makes when the cost of not having you starts to outweigh the comfort of staying uncommitted. And you cannot manufacture that cost through more effort, more patience, or more proof. You can only create it by living in a way where your presence is genuinely conditional on being valued, not infinitely available, regardless of how you're treated. This is why some of the most talented, most attractive, most emotionally generous people you will ever meet spend years being wanted without ever being chosen, while people with far less obvious appeal seem to get chosen again and again. It has nothing to do with deserving it more. It has everything to do with understanding that being chosen is not something you earn through accumulation. It is something that becomes possible the moment you stop being a guaranteed, no-cost option and start being someone whose presence in a person's life actually requires a decision. Once you internalize that distinction, you stop chasing more ways to prove your worth and start focusing on the only thing that actually changes the equation: how conditional your presence really is. It's worth being precise about what conditional presence actually means in practice, because it is easy to misinterpret it as coldness or withholding affection as strategy. Conditional presence simply means your time and attention are tied to how you're actually being treated, not to how much you hope things will improve, not to how good someone's potential looks on paper, and not to how much history the two of you share. It means that when the balance of effort tips too far in one direction for too long, your behavior actually reflects that imbalance instead of compensating for it. This is not about tracking every text message or demanding perfect reciprocity in every interaction. Relationships are not spreadsheets, and trying to make them one creates its own kind of resentment. It is about paying attention to the overall pattern over time and being willing to let your presence genuinely shrink when that pattern shows someone consistently taking more than they give, rather than performing the same full presence regardless of what's actually happening between you. This willingness to let your presence shrink is, more than anything else, what separates people who eventually get chosen from people who spend years hoping to be. It is not louder communication. It is not better arguments for why you deserve more. It is the simple, quiet act of letting your actual behavior match the actual state of the relationship, instead of letting your actions stay frozen at maximum generosity regardless of what's being returned. Chapter 2. How you trained people to see you as optional. Nobody wakes up one day and decides to be someone's backup plan. It happens gradually, through 1,000 small moments where you taught the people around you, often without realizing it, exactly how much effort was required to keep you close. And the uncomfortable truth is this: people treat you the way you have shown them they are allowed to, not the way you deserve, not the way you hope, the way you have demonstrated through your actions and your tolerance. That is acceptable. Consider the pattern that plays out in so many relationships, romantic or otherwise. Someone shows initial interest. You respond immediately, enthusiastically, with your full attention. They take a day to reply. You don't say anything about it. They cancel plans. You tell them it's fine. They show up only when it's convenient for them. And you're there every time, because you don't want to seem difficult or needy or dramatic. Each one of these moments feels small and forgivable in isolation. But you are not sending one message when you do this. You are sending 1,000 tiny signals that say, I will accept less than I deserve, and I will not hold you accountable for it. And people learn from signals far faster than they learn from words. This is not about blaming yourself for being kind, patient, or forgiving. Those are not flaws. The problem is not generosity itself. It is unconditional generosity. Generosity that is never matched, never questioned, never withdrawn, even when it is clearly being taken advantage of. Unconditional availability teaches people that your presence requires no investment, and anything that requires no investment is, by definition, undervalued. This is true in economics, and it is equally true in relationships. A resource that costs nothing to access will always be treated as though it costs nothing, no matter how genuinely valuable it actually is. There is also a subtler version of this pattern, one that is harder to recognize because it disguises itself as strength. It is the habit of being endlessly understanding, of always having an explanation ready for someone else's inconsistency before they even have to offer one themselves. They were busy. They're going through something. They don't mean anything by it. This reflex to protect other people from the consequences of their own behavior feels like emotional maturity. But very often, it is actually self-abandonment wearing the costume of patience. Every time you explain away someone's inconsistency instead of naming it, you remove their obligation to ever change it. Because why would they change something you've already forgiven before they even asked? The way out of this pattern is not to become cold, punishing, or impossible to please. It is to start letting your actions carry real consequences again. Consequences are not punishments, they are information. When someone treats you inconsistently and your response stays exactly the same regardless, you are giving them no information at all. Their behavior and your behavior become disconnected. And once they're disconnected, there is no longer any incentive for the other person to adjust. But when your warmth, your time, and your energy are actually responsive to how you're being treated, you reintroduce a feedback loop that most people, whether consciously or not, are extremely sensitive to. This does not mean you keep score or punish people for small mistakes. It means you stop pretending that consistent effort and inconsistent effort deserve the exact same reward. Retraining this dynamic starts with a single, uncomfortable but necessary shift. You have to become willing to let people experience the natural result of their own behavior, even when that result is that they lose access to you. Not as a threat, not as an ultimatum, simply as the truth. If someone is not willing to meet you with consistent effort, the most respectful thing you can do for yourself is to stop offering consistent effort in return, because continuing to do so is not kindness. It is a quiet form of self-erasure. It helps to understand why this pattern is so difficult to break, even once you can see it clearly. For many people, the instinct to overextend was learned long before any specific relationship began. It was learned in childhood homes where love felt conditional on being easy, being helpful, being low maintenance. It was learned in friendships where speaking up led to being labeled dramatic. It was learned in earlier relationships where setting a boundary led to abandonment, so silence and accommodation started to feel safer than honesty. If this describes you, the pattern of training people to see you as optional is not a personal failing. It is a survival strategy you built at a time when it genuinely protected you. The problem is that a strategy built for survival in one context becomes a liability in another. And continuing to run it long after it stopped protecting you is what keeps you stuck. Unlearning this pattern requires you to tolerate a very specific kind of discomfort. The discomfort of someone being upset with you, disappointed in you, or less warm toward you, without you immediately rushing in to fix it, smooth it over, or over-explain your way back into their good graces. This discomfort is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is the exact sensation of a new boundary being tested for the first time. Most people give up right at this point because the discomfort feels unbearable, and they mistake it for evidence that the boundary was wrong. But discomfort during a boundary is not proof of failure. It is proof that the boundary is real. Boundaries that don't produce any discomfort were never boundaries to begin with. They were just preferences. Nobody was ever going to challenge anyway. There is a helpful reframe that makes this process easier to sustain over time. Instead of thinking of boundaries as things you impose on other people, think of them as information you're finally allowing other people to have. Every time you soften a boundary, delay a consequence, or over-explain your way out of enforcing a standard, you are withholding accurate information about what it actually takes to be close to you. That withheld information doesn't protect the relationship. It distorts it, because the other person is operating on a false model of what you'll tolerate. Giving them accurate information, even when it's uncomfortable to deliver, is not an act of hostility. It is one of the most honest things you can offer another person, because it allows them to actually choose with full information whether they're willing to meet the real version of you rather than the endlessly accommodating version you've been presenting instead. Chapter 3. The Psychology of Scarcity and Why the Brain Values What It Might Lose. To understand why some people become unforgettable while others become easily replaceable, you have to understand one of the most consistent patterns in human psychology. We do not assign value based on quality alone. We assign value based on the perceived risk of loss. This principle shows up everywhere, from the stock market to real estate to job offers, and it shows up with equal force in how human beings decide who matters to them and who doesn't. There is a well-documented phenomenon in behavioral psychology called loss aversion, and it describes something almost every person experiences without realizing it. The pain of losing something is psychologically far more intense than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. This asymmetry means that human beings are wired to fight harder to avoid losing what they have than to acquire something new. And this is exactly why availability, when it is unconditional and guaranteed, actually works against you. If there is never any real possibility that someone could lose you, their brain has no reason to activate the powerful protective instincts that loss aversion is designed to trigger. You simply become a fixture, something assumed rather than something appreciated. This is why scarcity, real scarcity, not manufactured or performative scarcity, has such a powerful psychological effect. When something is genuinely limited, when there is a real chance it could be gone tomorrow, the brain reassigns value to it almost instantly. This is not a trick or a manipulation tactic. It is a fundamental feature of how human perception works. And here is the critical distinction you need to understand. Scarcity that is faked through games, through playing hard to get, through manufactured distance, while secretly still being desperate for someone's approval, is eventually detected. And once it's detected, it destroys trust entirely. But scarcity that is real, the natural result of you having a full life, high standards, and genuine options, cannot be detected as manipulation because it isn't manipulation. It's simply the truth of who you are. This is where so many well-meaning people go wrong when they try to apply this psychology. They hear that scarcity creates value, and they try to simulate it by playing games, delaying replies on purpose, pretending to be busy, acting uninterested, while quietly hoping the other person notices and chases. This approach fails for a simple reason. It is not actually scarcity. It is performance. And performance requires you to constantly maintain a lie about your own availability and interest. Real scarcity requires no performance at all, because it comes from an authentic reality. You genuinely have other priorities, other relationships, other sources of fulfillment, and your attention toward any one person is genuinely limited by the fact that your life is genuinely full. This is the fundamental shift you need to make. Instead of asking, "How do I make this person think I'm scarce?" ask yourself, "How do I build a life so full, so purposeful, and so satisfying that my attention actually becomes a limited resource, one that I extend deliberately rather than automatically?" When your time and energy are authentically scarce because they are being invested in real pursuits, real growth, and real relationships, you no longer have to pretend to be selective. You simply are selective because you have to be. And people can feel the difference between someone who is performing unavailability and someone who is simply, genuinely, living a life that does not revolve around waiting for them to show up. Once you understand this principle, your goal stops being, "How do I get this specific person to want me more?" and becomes, "How do I build a life so rich in purpose and possibility that becoming part of it is genuinely something someone has to earn?" That shift alone, more than any tactic, technique, or clever line, is what separates people who are chosen from people who are simply available. There is a reason this principle applies with equal force outside of romantic contexts, in friendships, in professional relationships, in family dynamics. Consider how differently people treat a colleague who is known to be in high demand. Someone whose time is clearly valuable because multiple people and projects are competing for it, compared to how they treat a colleague who is known to always be free, always willing to take on extra work, always available for a last-minute favor. The first colleague's time gets protected, scheduled around, respected. The second colleague's time gets absorbed, assumed, and often quietly resented for being so easily available, even though availability was offered generously and in good faith. The exact same generosity produces two completely different outcomes, depending on whether it exists within a context of genuine scarcity or unconditional excess. This is not an argument for becoming stingy with your time or affection. It is an argument for understanding that unlimited supply of anything, no matter how good, eventually gets treated as though it has no value, simply because human perception is built around relative scarcity, not absolute quality. A rare gemstone and a common stone can be chemically similar, but their perceived worth is defined almost entirely by how much of each exists and how difficult each is to obtain. People, uncomfortable as it may be to admit, are perceived through a similar lens. Your kindness, your intelligence, your loyalty, your humor. None of these qualities lose their inherent worth when you become more selective about who receives them. But the perception of their worth, in the eyes of others, changes dramatically based on how freely and unconditionally you distribute them. This is also why attempts to manufacture scarcity artificially tend to backfire so badly once discovered. People are remarkably good, even if only subconsciously, at distinguishing authentic limitation from performed limitation. Authentic scarcity has a texture to it, a consistency, because it flows from something real. An actual full schedule, actual other priorities, an actual sense of purpose that doesn't bend around any one person's convenience. Performed scarcity, by contrast, tends to crack under pressure because it isn't rooted in anything real. The moment the other person applies a little more attention or effort, the performance collapses, and the desperation that was being hidden underneath it becomes obvious. This is precisely why the only sustainable path to being perceived as valuable is to actually build the underlying reality, the full life, the genuine standards, the real sense of purpose, rather than trying to shortcut your way to the appearance of it. Chapter 4. Why self-worth cannot be outsourced. At the root of every pattern we've discussed so far, the overgiving, the unconditional availability, the fear of setting real consequences, lies a single core issue that has to be addressed before any lasting change can happen. The habit of outsourcing your sense of worth to other people's opinions of you. If your value as a person rises and falls based on whether someone else texts you back, prioritizes you, or seems interested, you have handed over the single most important psychological resource you own, the ability to determine your own worth, to someone who has no obligation to protect it. This is not a minor issue. This is the entire foundation of why people become easy to overlook. When your self-worth depends on external validation, you become desperate for that validation in ways you may not even consciously recognize. And desperation has a distinct energy that other people, often subconsciously, pick up on immediately. It shows up as over-explaining yourself, as apologizing for things that don't require an apology, as constantly checking in to make sure everything is okay, as agreeing to plans and terms that don't actually work for you because saying no feels too risky. None of these behaviors look dramatic from the outside, but together they broadcast a single message. I need your approval more than you need mine. And the moment someone senses that imbalance, the power dynamic shifts entirely in their favor, whether they intend it to or not. Self-worth that is internally generated works completely differently. When you know your value independent of any single relationship, friendship, or romantic interest, you stop needing constant reassurance, because you're not relying on other people to tell you something you should already know about yourself. This does not mean becoming arrogant or indifferent to how others treat you. It means your baseline sense of self does not collapse the moment someone fails to text back quickly, cancels plans, or seems distracted. You can still care about someone's behavior and set boundaries around it, without that behavior determining whether you feel like a worthy person. Building this kind of internally generated worth is not accomplished through affirmations alone, though changing your internal language matters. It is built through evidence, real, accumulated evidence that you can rely on yourself every time you follow through on a commitment you made to yourself. Every time you pursue a goal that has nothing to do with impressing anyone else, every time you tolerate the discomfort of disappointing someone in order to stay aligned with your own standards, you are making a deposit into a kind of psychological bank account. Over time, This account becomes substantial enough that you no longer need to borrow validation from other people because you have built up a reserve of self-trust that doesn't fluctuate with someone else's mood or attention span. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from this shift, one that is difficult to describe until you've experienced it. It is the freedom of no longer needing anyone's approval in order to feel like you are enough. And paradoxically, this is exactly the energy that makes people want to be around you more. Not because you're chasing their approval, but because you've stopped needing it. And unclaimed, unbothered self-assurance is one of the rarest and most magnetic qualities a person can carry into any relationship. The work here is not glamorous. It looks like setting small boundaries even when it's uncomfortable. It looks like not sending the third follow-up text when someone hasn't responded. It looks like continuing to build your own life, your own goals, your own routines, regardless of whether a specific person notices or cares. None of these actions are dramatic on their own, but collectively, they are what rebuilding an internally generated sense of worth actually looks like in practice. And this rebuilding is the non-negotiable foundation. Everything else in this audiobook is built on top of. One of the clearest signs that your self-worth is still being outsourced is how quickly your mood shifts based on small, ambiguous signals from other people. A slightly shorter text than usual sends you into a spiral of wondering what you did wrong. A delayed reply gets interpreted as rejection before you have any actual evidence to support that interpretation. A change in someone's tone gets analyzed for hours, replayed, dissected, until you've built an entire narrative about your own inadequacy out of nothing more than a single ambiguous sentence. This hypervigilance is exhausting, and it is also a clear signal that your internal sense of security has been outsourced to someone else's behavior. Behavior you have no actual control over. Reclaiming that security starts with a simple but demanding practice. Learning to sit with ambiguity without immediately filling it with your worst-case interpretation. When you don't know why someone hasn't responded, the honest answer is that you don't know. Not that you did something wrong, not that they've lost interest, not that you're somehow unworthy of a timely reply. Training yourself to tolerate not knowing, without manufacturing a story to fill the gap, is one of the most underrated skills in building durable self-worth, because so much anxiety in relationships comes not from what actually happens, but from the stories we tell ourselves while waiting to find out. There is one more dimension of this work that deserves emphasis, because it is often overlooked in conversations about self-worth. The role of your own word to yourself. Every broken promise you make to yourself, the workout you skip, the boundary you don't hold, the goal you quietly abandon without acknowledging it, chips away at your own credibility in your own eyes, and you cannot build durable self-trust while simultaneously breaking small promises to yourself on a regular basis. No matter how much positive self-talk you layer on top, self-worth that lasts is not built through affirmation alone. It is built through the accumulated evidence of a person who does what they say they're going to do for themselves, regardless of whether anyone else is watching or would ever know the difference. This is slow, unglamorous work, but it is also the only kind of work that produces a sense of worth sturdy enough to withstand another person's inconsistency without crumbling. Chapter 5. The Abundance Shift. Why options change everything. There is a specific psychological state that separates people who are chronically undervalued from people who are consistently prioritized, and it has almost nothing to do with looks, charisma, or even social skill. It is the difference between operating from scarcity and operating from abundance. Someone operating from scarcity believes, consciously or not, that this particular person, this particular opportunity, this particular relationship is rare and irreplaceable, and that if it doesn't work out, something equally good may never come along again. Someone operating from abundance understands that, while this specific connection may be valuable, it is not their only possible source of connection, opportunity, or fulfillment, and this belief changes everything about how they show up. Scarcity thinking creates desperation, even when it's hidden well. It makes people tolerate disrespect because they're afraid that walking away means being left with nothing. It makes people overinvest early, revealing their full hand before they've gathered any real information about whether the other person is actually worth that investment. It makes people afraid to express real opinions, real boundaries, or real disagreement, because conflict feels like it might cost them the one thing they believe they can't afford to lose. Every one of these behaviors, driven by scarcity thinking, communicates low value, regardless of how much actual value the person possesses. Abundance thinking does the opposite. When you genuinely believe, because it is genuinely true, that you have other options, other paths to fulfillment, other people who would value you, and other ways your life could unfold that would still be meaningful, you stop needing any single relationship to work out in order to feel secure. This does not mean you stop caring about outcomes. It means you stop being controlled by them. You can want a specific relationship to succeed while simultaneously knowing that your worth, your future, and your happiness do not depend entirely on it succeeding. That combination, genuine investment without desperate dependency, is exactly what allows people to show up as their most authentic, most confident, and most attractive selves, because they are no longer performing for an outcome they're terrified of losing. Building actual abundance, not fake, performed abundance, requires deliberate action. It requires you to genuinely diversify where your sense of connection, fulfillment, and identity comes from. If one person is your only source of validation, your only source of excitement, your only social outlet, you have architected a situation where losing them would genuinely devastate you, and that reality, even if you never say it out loud, radiates outward in everything you do. But if your life includes multiple meaningful friendships, personal goals you're actively pursuing, interests that light you up independent of anyone else's involvement, and a general sense of forward momentum in your own life, then no single relationship carries the crushing weight of being your entire emotional infrastructure. This is why people who are deeply immersed in building something, a business, a craft, a passion, a body of skills, so often become more attractive to others, not because busyness itself is appealing, but because it is undeniable proof that their world does not revolve entirely around waiting to be chosen. Their abundance is not manufactured for effect. It is a natural byproduct of living a life with real direction. And direction, more than any technique you could ever learn, is what makes a person impossible to take for granted. The shift from scarcity to abundance is not something that happens overnight, and it is not something you can fake convincingly for long. It has to be built deliberately through the accumulation of real experiences, real relationships, and real personal growth that exist entirely independent of any one person's decision to stay or go. But once that abundance becomes real, something shifts permanently in how you show up in every relationship you enter. And the people around you feel that shift long before you ever have to explain it. There is a practical starting point for building this kind of abundance. And it begins with an honest audit of where your emotional eggs currently sit. If you were to map out every source of connection, excitement, and validation in your life right now, would that map show a wide, resilient network of relationships and pursuits, or would it show a single, overloaded connection, carrying almost the entire weight? Most people who struggle with being taken for granted discover, when they actually do this audit, that one person has quietly become responsible for the majority of their emotional well-being, while every other relationship and personal pursuit has been allowed to fade into the background. Rebuilding abundance means deliberately reversing that imbalance, not by withdrawing from the person who matters, but by reinvesting in everything else that was neglected while your attention was consumed elsewhere. This reinvestment does not need to be dramatic to be effective. Reconnecting with an old friend you've let the relationship with go quiet. Returning to a hobby or skill you set aside. Setting a personal goal that has nothing to do with impressing anyone and everything to do with your own growth. Each of these actions, individually small, works together to rebuild the foundation of a life that does not collapse if one relationship doesn't go the way you hoped. And it is precisely that foundation, solid, diversified, and genuinely fulfilling on its own terms, that makes you the kind of person others recognize, almost instinctively, as someone worth choosing, rather than someone worth simply keeping around. It is worth pausing here, at the close of these first 5 chapters, to notice how each of these ideas builds directly on the one before it. Understanding the difference between being wanted and being chosen showed you what you're actually working toward. Recognizing how you trained people to see you as optional showed you how the current pattern was built. Understanding the psychology of scarcity showed you why unconditional availability quietly erodes value. Reclaiming your self-worth from external validation gave you the internal foundation none of this works without. And building genuine abundance gave you the practical structure that makes all of it sustainable rather than temporary. None of these shifts happen through willpower alone, and none of them happen overnight. But together, they form the groundwork for everything still ahead. Because before you can change how anyone else treats you, you have to change the internal architecture that has been quietly inviting the treatment you've been getting all along. Chapter 6. Standards are filters, not walls. There is a common fear that stops people from raising their standards, even after they've done the internal work of rebuilding their self-worth. It is the fear that having standards will make you seem difficult, high maintenance, or unreasonable, and that raising the bar for how you expect to be treated will simply shrink the pool of people willing to be in your life. This fear is understandable, but it rests on a misunderstanding of what standards actually do. Standards are not walls built to keep people out. They are filters built to reveal who was actually capable of meeting you in the first place. A wall stops everyone indiscriminately. A filter simply separates what passes through from what doesn't. And anything that doesn't pass through was never going to hold up under real conditions anyway. Think about what happens when you lower your standards to keep someone around. You are not actually gaining a better relationship. You are simply delaying the moment when the mismatch between what you need and what they're willing to give becomes undeniable. Every time you accept less than what you actually want in order to avoid losing someone, you are not solving the underlying incompatibility. You are postponing it, usually at significant cost to your own well-being in the meantime. The relationship doesn't become healthier because you lowered your expectations. It simply becomes a slower version of the same disappointment, stretched out over more time and more emotional investment. This is why raising your standards, even though it initially feels like it's making things harder, is actually the fastest path to the relationships you actually want. When your standards are clear, and more importantly, when you are actually willing to enforce them through your behavior rather than just stating them, you stop wasting months or years on connections that were never going to develop into what you needed. People who are not willing or able to meet those standards self-select out early, which feels uncomfortable in the moment, but saves you from the much greater cost of investing deeply in something that was always going to disappoint you. And people who are capable of meeting those standards are not scared away by them. They are drawn to them, because standards signal exactly the kind of self-respect and clarity that genuinely secure people find attractive rather than intimidating. There is an important distinction to make here between rigid, punishing standards and standards that come from genuine self-respect. Rigid standards are usually a defense mechanism, a way of testing people to prove they'll fail before they get the chance to actually hurt you. These standards are often unstated, shifting, or impossible to actually satisfy, because their real purpose is protection rather than genuine partnership. Standards rooted in self-respect are different. They are usually simple, consistent, and communicated clearly, not as ultimatums, but as an honest description of what you need in order to feel respected and secure. The difference is not in how high the bar is set. It's in whether the bar exists to protect you from ever being vulnerable, or to ensure that when you are vulnerable, it's with someone who has actually demonstrated they're capable of holding that vulnerability with care. Building this kind of standard starts with getting specific. Vague standards like, "I want someone who treats me well," are almost impossible to enforce because they leave too much room for interpretation and rationalization. Specific standards: someone who follows through on plans they make, someone who communicates when something is bothering them instead of going silent, someone who makes an effort to include me in their life rather than keeping me separate from it, are far easier to actually hold because you know exactly what you're looking for and exactly what it looks like when that standard isn't being met. The clearer your standards, the easier it becomes to notice early when someone isn't capable of meeting them, which is precisely the information you need in order to stop over-investing in the wrong direction. There is one more dimension worth naming here, because it explains why so many people, even after recognizing the value of raising their standards, still struggle to actually hold them. It is the belief that a standard only counts if it's held perfectly, every single time, without exception. This belief sets an impossible bar, and when inevitably missed, creates so much shame that people abandon the standard entirely rather than simply recommitting to it. Holding a standard is not about flawless enforcement. It is about a general, consistent direction, one where slips happen, get noticed, and get corrected, rather than a single lapse becoming permission to abandon the standard altogether. Progress here looks like catching yourself faster each time, not never slipping at all. It's also worth addressing a specific fear that tends to surface once someone starts genuinely raising their standards: the fear of ending up alone. This fear deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. because it is often rooted in real past experience. Moments where holding a boundary did in fact cost someone a relationship they cared about. But it's important to separate two very different outcomes that get conflated under the umbrella of ending up alone. There is being alone because you refuse to accept treatment that didn't meet your standards. And there is being lonely while surrounded by relationships that were never actually meeting your needs in the first place. The second state, loneliness inside an unsatisfying relationship, is far more common than people acknowledge. And it is, in many ways, worse than genuine solitude because it comes with the added exhaustion of maintaining a connection that isn't actually nourishing you. Raising your standards does not guarantee you'll never spend time single or between relationships. What it guarantees is that the relationships you do have will actually be capable of meeting your needs, rather than simply occupying the space where a real connection should be. There is a longer-term benefit to holding standards that isn't always obvious in the short term. Standards, over time, actually shape the pool of people who approach you and stay around you. People calibrate their behavior based on what they observe is acceptable. If your standards are consistently enforced, word travels. Not necessarily through explicit conversation, but through the general impression you leave that you are someone who expects real effort and real consistency. This reputation, built through consistent behavior rather than explicit statements, naturally filters out people who are only ever looking for someone easy to take advantage of, while drawing in people who are looking for exactly the kind of mutual respect your standards represent. In this way, holding your standards is not just a defensive strategy, it's an active mechanism for curating the relationships available to you going forward. One final point deserves attention before moving on, because it addresses a question that often arises once someone commits to raising their standards. What happens when someone you care about simply cannot meet them, not out of unwillingness, but out of genuine limitation? This is a real and important distinction. Someone who won't meet your standards is choosing not to prioritize your needs. Someone who genuinely can't, due to circumstances, capacity, or their own unresolved struggles, is a different situation entirely. And it deserves compassion rather than resentment. But compassion for their limitation does not obligate you to abandon your own needs in order to accommodate it. You can hold both truths simultaneously, understanding why someone struggles to meet a particular standard, while still recognizing that you deserve a relationship where that standard is met. Sometimes this means the relationship changes form. Sometimes it means it ends. And sometimes it means both people grow into a place where the standard eventually can be met. What it should never mean is quietly lowering your own needs indefinitely simply because someone else's limitations make meeting them difficult. Chapter 7. The Power of Emotional Steadiness. If there is one trait that consistently separates people who are chosen from people who are merely tolerated, it is emotional steadiness, the ability to remain grounded, calm, and consistent, regardless of how chaotic or inconsistent the people or circumstances around you become. This is not the same as suppressing your emotions or pretending not to care. It is the ability to feel your emotions fully without being controlled by them, to experience disappointment, hurt, or frustration without those feelings dictating erratic or desperate behavior in the moment. Emotional steadiness is rare precisely because it's difficult to cultivate, and its rarity is exactly what makes it so magnetic. Most people, when they feel uncertain about where they stand with someone, respond by escalating, sending more messages, asking more questions, seeking more reassurance, or by withdrawing entirely into cold silence or dramatic distance. Both of these responses, though they look like opposites, come from the same underlying place: emotional dysregulation in the face of uncertainty. Someone with genuine emotional steadiness responds to that same uncertainty completely differently. They notice the discomfort of not knowing where they stand. They allow themselves to feel it honestly, and then they continue behaving in alignment with their own values and standards, rather than letting the discomfort hijack their behavior. This matters enormously in how other people experience being around you. Being around someone who is emotionally reactive, whose mood and behavior shift dramatically based on small, ambiguous signals, is exhausting, even for people who care about that person. It creates a walking on eggshells dynamic where everyone around them has to constantly manage that person's emotional state, which is draining and, over time, breeds resentment rather than closeness. Being around someone who is emotionally steady, whose mood does not swing wildly based on whether a text was answered quickly or whether plans got slightly rearranged, is fundamentally more restful. It signals psychological safety. The sense that this person can handle whatever happens without falling apart or requiring constant management, and psychological safety is one of the most underrated ingredients in what makes people want to stay close to someone rather than pull away. Developing emotional steadiness is not about becoming numb or disconnected from your feelings. It requires the opposite, actually. A willingness to sit with uncomfortable emotions long enough to understand them, rather than immediately discharging them through reactive behavior. When you feel the urge to send an anxious follow-up message, the practice is not to suppress that urge and pretend you don't feel anxious. The practice is to notice the anxiety, name it honestly to yourself, and then make a deliberate choice about whether acting on it actually serves you, rather than acting automatically because the discomfort feels unbearable in the moment. This pause between the feeling and the action is where emotional steadiness actually lives, and it is a skill that strengthens with deliberate practice, the same way any other muscle does. There is also a physiological component to this that is worth understanding. When you feel anxious about where you stand with someone, your nervous system often interprets that uncertainty as a genuine threat, triggering the same fight-or-flight response that would activate if you were in actual physical danger. This is why the urge to immediately resolve uncertainty through a text, a call, a confrontation can feel so overwhelming. It is not simply a psychological preference. It is your body trying to escape a state of threat. Understanding this can help you approach the discomfort with more compassion rather than judgment. The goal is not to eliminate this physiological response entirely. That isn't realistic. The goal is to build enough capacity to tolerate the discomfort of an activated nervous system without letting it dictate your next move. Giving yourself the space to respond deliberately rather than react automatically. A practical way to build this capacity is to create a small gap, even just a few minutes, between the urge to react and the action itself. When the anxious impulse arrives, resist responding immediately. Let a little time pass. Notice whether the urgency you felt in that first moment is still just as strong once some time has gone by. More often than not, you'll find that the intensity fades on its own, revealing that the impulse was driven by temporary discomfort rather than genuine necessity. Practicing this gap repeatedly, in small, low-stakes moments, is what gradually builds the emotional steadiness that becomes so noticeable and so magnetic in higher stakes ones. It's important to distinguish emotional steadiness from emotional suppression, because the two are frequently confused, and the confusion causes real harm. Suppression involves pushing feelings down, pretending they don't exist, presenting a calm exterior while internally spiraling. This is not sustainable, and it usually leaks out eventually, often in ways that are more damaging than if the emotion had simply been expressed honestly in the first place, through passive aggression, sudden emotional outbursts disproportionate to the immediate trigger, or a slow withdrawal that the other person can sense but can't quite explain. Genuine emotional steadiness requires the opposite of suppression: full acknowledgement of what you're feeling, just without letting that feeling dictate impulsive behavior. The steadiness lives in the gap between acknowledgement and action, not in the absence of feeling altogether. There is also a social dimension to emotional steadiness, worth naming directly. People consistently underestimate how much their own emotional state is being read and absorbed by everyone around them in ways that shape how those people respond in return. This is sometimes described as emotional contagion, the well-documented tendency for one person's emotional state to influence the emotional state of people nearby, even without a single word being exchanged. When you walk into a conversation carrying anxious, reactive energy, the other person often feels that energy before you've said anything, and it shapes how guarded, defensive, or cautious they become in response. When you walk in carrying calm, grounded energy, even during a difficult conversation, that steadiness tends to invite a similarly regulated response from the other person. This is not a guaranteed formula. Some people will exploit calm as an opportunity to escalate further. But as a general pattern, emotional steadiness tends to produce more emotional steadiness in return, which is one more reason it is worth the deliberate effort required to build it. There's a distinction between emotional steadiness and emotional detachment that deserves clear emphasis, because the two are sometimes confused in ways that lead people down an unhelpful path. Detachment is a defense mechanism, a way of avoiding vulnerability altogether by refusing to let yourself care enough for the outcome to matter. It might look similar to steadiness from the outside, calm, unbothered, unreactive, but it comes from a completely different internal place, one rooted in avoidance rather than genuine security. Someone who is detached doesn't feel less anxious about uncertainty. They've simply stopped allowing themselves to invest enough to feel the anxiety in the first place, which also means they've stopped allowing themselves to genuinely connect. Emotional steadiness, by contrast, still involves real investment, real caring, real stakes. It simply involves managing the discomfort of those stakes without letting it dictate reactive behavior. The goal covered throughout this chapter is steadiness, not detachment. And confusing the two often leads people toward a guarded, self-protective posture that ultimately prevents the very closeness they're trying to build. Chapter 8. Communicating from security instead of fear. The way you communicate, particularly during moments of uncertainty or conflict, reveals more about your underlying sense of security than almost anything else you do. Two people can say nearly identical words and communicate completely different messages, depending on whether those words come from a place of genuine security or a place of underlying fear. Learning to recognize this difference in your own communication and in others is one of the most valuable skills you can develop if you want to stop being seen as an option and start being seen as a priority. Fear-based communication tends to have a few recognizable patterns. It over-explains, providing far more justification than the situation actually requires. Because the underlying belief is that if you don't explain enough, you'll be misunderstood or abandoned. It seeks premature reassurance, asking, "Are we okay? Or do you still like me?" before there's actually been any real indication that something is wrong, because uncertainty itself feels unbearable rather than simply uncomfortable. It softens boundaries into something barely resembling a boundary at all, turning "I need you to communicate with me more consistently" into something like "It's totally fine. I know you're busy, just whenever you get a chance. No pressure at all," which communicates the opposite of what was actually needed. Fear-based communication is exhausting for the person delivering it, and often confusing for the person receiving it, because the actual message gets buried under layers of anxious cushioning. Security-based communication looks completely different. It is direct without being harsh. It states what's true without excessive justification, because the underlying belief is that the truth doesn't require extensive defense. It simply requires honest expression. It doesn't seek reassurance prematurely, because it can tolerate genuine uncertainty without needing it immediately resolved. And it delivers boundaries clearly, without excessive softening. Not because security means being blunt or cold, but because security means trusting that a clearly stated boundary, delivered with respect, doesn't need to be wrapped in 10 layers of apology in order to be acceptable. Learning to communicate from security rather than fear is largely a matter of slowing down before you speak or send a message, and asking yourself a simple question: am I saying this because it's true and needs to be said? Or am I saying this because I'm anxious and want immediate relief from that anxiety? These are not always mutually exclusive. Sometimes something true does need to be said, and you happen to feel anxious about saying it, but distinguishing between the two helps you catch the moments when what you're about to send is really just an anxiety management strategy disguised as communication, the follow-up text that doesn't actually add any new information, the lengthy explanation for a boundary that doesn't need to be justified at all, the question you already know the answer to, but are asking anyway because you want to hear it confirmed. This shift changes not just how you're perceived, but how effective your communication actually becomes. Security-based communication is taken more seriously precisely because it isn't diluted by unnecessary anxiety. When you speak clearly, calmly, and without excessive over-explanation, people listen differently, because your words carry the weight of someone who trusts their own judgment rather than someone who's still seeking permission for their own feelings and needs. It also helps to recognize that security-based communication does not require you to hide the fact that something matters to you. There is a difference between anxious over-explaining and honest vulnerability, and the two are often confused. Saying "this matters to me and I'd like us to handle it differently going forward" is vulnerable, direct, and secure. Repeating that same sentiment 5 different ways, apologizing twice for bringing it up, and then reassuring the other person that it's really not a big deal right after stating that it is fear dressed up as openness. Security allows you to care deeply and say so plainly, without needing to soften the truth until it barely resembles what you actually meant. There's a specific communication pattern worth examining closely: because it captures the difference between fear and security more clearly than almost anything else. How each responds to silence. When someone goes quiet, whether it's a delayed reply, a pause in conversation, or genuine distance, fear-based communication tends to rush in to fill that silence immediately, often with something that wasn't fully thought through, sent purely to relieve the discomfort of not knowing. Security-based communication can tolerate the silence. It doesn't necessarily ignore it forever. There are times when addressing an extended silence directly is exactly the right move, but it does so deliberately, after genuine reflection, rather than as a reflexive attempt to end the discomfort as quickly as possible. This capacity to tolerate silence without needing to immediately fill it is one of the clearest outward signs of the internal security that this entire audiobook is built around cultivating. It's also worth addressing how security-based communication handles being misunderstood, because misunderstandings are inevitable in any relationship, and how you respond to them reveals a great deal. Fear-based communication tends to overcorrect when misunderstood, launching into lengthy clarifications, apologizing excessively for the confusion even when no real offense was intended, and sometimes abandoning the original point altogether just to avoid further friction. Security-based communication clarifies once, clearly, and then lets that clarification stand, trusting that a single honest clarification is sufficient and that continuing to over-explain would communicate insecurity rather than resolve the actual confusion. Learning to clarify once and stop, resisting the urge to keep circling back to make sure the point has really landed, is a small but powerful practice that reinforces the broader shift from fear-based to security-based communication in every interaction. There is also a version of this pattern that shows up specifically around expressing needs, and it's worth addressing directly because it trips up even people who have made real progress in other areas. Fear-based communication often disguises a genuine need as a hypothetical or a joke, testing the waters indirectly rather than stating the need plainly, because directly naming a need feels too exposed, too risky. This might sound like a passing comment about how nice it would be if plans got made further in advance, said lightly, almost as a joke, rather than a direct statement that advanced planning actually matters to you. The problem with this indirect approach is that it's easy to ignore, and it also puts the burden of interpretation entirely on the other person, who may not even register that a real need was just expressed. Security-based communication states the need plainly. I'd really appreciate more advance notice for plans. It matters to me. This is a small shift in language, but a significant shift in outcome, because plainly stated needs are far more likely to actually be met than needs disguised as jokes or hypotheticals, hoping to be picked up on without ever having to risk stating them directly. Chapter 9. Reading investment instead of interpreting interest. One of the most common and costly mistakes people make in relationships of every kind is confusing interest with investment. Interest is easy to fake, easy to feel temporarily, and easy to express without any real cost. Investment requires sacrifice, consistency, and follow-through over time. Learning to distinguish between the two, rather than getting swept up in the flattering feeling of someone's temporary interest, is essential if you want to stop pouring your energy into people who were never actually going to prioritize you. Interest often shows up as enthusiasm in the moment, engaged conversation, flattering attention, even physical or emotional intensity. But none of these things, on their own, tell you anything about whether someone is actually willing to invest real effort into building something sustained with you. Investment shows up differently. It shows up as consistency over time rather than intensity in isolated moments. It shows up as someone making space for you in their actual life, not just their attention when it's convenient. It shows up as someone following through on what they say, not just saying things that sound good in the moment. It shows up as someone being willing to have difficult conversations rather than disappearing when things get uncomfortable. These behaviors require actual cost, actual effort, actual prioritization, which is exactly why they're a far more reliable signal of someone's real intentions than how interested they seem to be on any given day. This distinction matters because interest without investment is one of the most common ways people end up feeling like an option rather than a priority. Someone can be genuinely, authentically interested in you and still never actually invest the effort required to build a real relationship. Because interest requires nothing of them beyond feeling a certain way, while investment requires them to actually change their behavior, their priorities, and sometimes their comfort in order to make room for you. Mistaking one for the other keeps people stuck for years, waiting for interest to eventually convert into investment, when in reality, the two are not even on the same continuum. Someone either is willing to invest or they aren't. And no amount of additional interest, however genuine, automatically produces that willingness. Learning to read investment rather than interest requires you to pay closer attention to patterns over isolated moments. A single grand gesture means far less than consistent, unremarkable follow-through over weeks and months. A single deep conversation means far less than someone consistently making time for you even when it's inconvenient. This is not about becoming cynical or refusing to enjoy genuine moments of connection when they happen. It is about not building your expectations, your hope, or your emotional investment on the foundation of isolated moments of interest, and instead calibrating your own investment to match the actual, demonstrated investment you're receiving in return. A useful habit here is what might be called the effort audit, periodically stepping back and honestly tallying who initiated plans, who followed up after a disagreement, who adjusted their schedule to make room for the other over the last several weeks or months. This is not about creating a scoreboard to win. It's about interrupting the natural human tendency to remember flattering moments far more vividly than routine ones, which can leave you with a distorted sense of how balanced a relationship actually is. An honest effort audit, done without judgment, often reveals imbalances that were invisible in the moment but obvious in aggregate, and that clarity is exactly what allows you to recalibrate your own investment accordingly. There's a particular trap worth naming directly here, because it's one of the most common reasons people continue investing in interest rather than investment long after the pattern has become clear. The sunk cost of hope. The longer you've waited for someone's interest to convert into real investment, the harder it becomes to accept that it might never happen, because accepting that would mean acknowledging that the time and emotional energy already spent may not lead where you hoped. This is a well-documented cognitive bias, the tendency to continue investing in something specifically because of how much has already been invested, rather than because of what the future actually looks likely to hold. Recognizing this bias in yourself doesn't make the decision to stop waiting painless. But it does make it possible to see clearly that the amount of time already spent is not, on its own, a good reason to keep spending more. It's also worth noting the specific role that potential plays in this trap. Many people stay invested in interest without investment because they can vividly imagine what the relationship could become if the other person just showed up differently. This imagined future, built from potential rather than actual demonstrated behavior, can feel incredibly real and incredibly compelling. Sometimes more compelling than the actual present reality of the relationship. But potential is not evidence. And building your investment around what someone could become, rather than who they've actually shown themselves to be through consistent behavior over time, is one of the most reliable ways to end up years deep in a connection that never actually developed the way you kept believing it eventually would. A related pattern worth naming is what might be called the exception collector, the habit of mentally cataloging every rare instance when someone did show up, did follow through, did prioritize you, and using those exceptions to override the far more consistent pattern of them not doing so. One thoughtful gesture, after months of inconsistency, gets remembered vividly and referenced often, while the months of inconsistency that preceded it fade into the background. This is not a character flaw. It reflects how human memory naturally works. We remember emotionally vivid exceptions more easily than we remember unremarkable routine. But recognizing this tendency allows you to correct for it deliberately, weighing the full pattern rather than the most emotionally memorable data points, when deciding how much to actually invest in someone going forward. Chapter 10. Becoming genuinely irreplaceable. Everything covered so far in this audiobook builds toward a single outcome: becoming someone whose presence in another person's life is not easily replaced by anyone else. This is not about being flawless, extraordinary, or impossible to compete with on paper. Plenty of people who are genuinely irreplaceable to the people who love them are not the most attractive, most successful, or most impressive people in any objective sense. Irreplaceability is not primarily about your resume of qualities. It's about the specific, unrepeatable experience of being around you, an experience that is shaped far more by your presence, your consistency, and your depth than by any external measure of your value. Being irreplaceable starts with being genuinely present when you're actually with someone, rather than distracted, half-engaged, or performing a version of interest that doesn't match your actual internal state. There is a difference, one that people feel intuitively even if they can't always name it, between someone who is physically present but emotionally elsewhere, and someone who is fully there, genuinely curious, genuinely listening, genuinely engaged. This kind of presence is increasingly rare in a world full of constant distraction. And its rarity is exactly what makes it so valuable when someone actually experiences it consistently from you. Irreplaceability also comes from depth, the willingness to actually know someone beyond the surface level, to remember the details they've shared, to notice changes in their mood or circumstances, to ask thoughtful follow-up questions instead of moving immediately back to talking about yourself. Most relationships, even ones that last for years, remain remarkably surface level, because genuine curiosity about another person requires effort, patience, and a willingness to set aside your own need to be interesting in favor of actually being interested. People who consistently offer this kind of depth become genuinely difficult to replace, because replacing them would mean finding someone else willing to invest that same level of attention and care, which, as it turns out, is far rarer than most people assume. Finally, irreplaceability comes from the accumulated weight of shared history, built not through the mere passage of time, but through consistency over that time. Anyone can know someone for years without ever becoming genuinely important to them, if those years were filled with surface-level interaction and unreliable presence. But consistent presence, consistent depth, and consistent follow-through, sustained over even a relatively short period, can create a bond that feels far more significant than years of inconsistent contact ever could. This is the ultimate lesson underlying everything in this chapter, and, really, everything covered up to this point. Becoming someone's first choice is not primarily about being extraordinary. It is about being reliably, consistently, genuinely yourself, showing up with real presence, real depth, and real follow-through, while maintaining enough self-respect to never offer that consistency unconditionally to people who haven't demonstrated they're capable of valuing it. That combination, consistency paired with self-respect, is what ultimately makes a person undeniable, and it is the thread that will carry through everything still ahead. It's worth reflecting, at the midpoint of this audiobook, on how dramatically the picture of what makes someone chosen differs from the picture most people carry around unconsciously. Most people believe becoming someone's first choice requires becoming more impressive, more attractive, more accomplished, essentially winning some kind of competition for the most objectively desirable qualities. What this chapter, and the 4 before it, have hopefully made clear is that this belief, while not entirely wrong, misses the actual mechanism by which people become truly chosen. It is not primarily a competition of qualities. It is a demonstration of consistency, presence, depth, and self-respect, sustained over time, that ultimately convinces someone that losing you would be a genuine loss, not simply the removal of one option among many interchangeable others. This reframe matters because it changes where you direct your energy. Instead of chasing more achievements, more polish, more impressive qualities in the hope that eventually you'll accumulate enough value to be chosen, you can direct that same energy toward the things that actually determine whether you're chosen. Showing up consistently, communicating from security rather than fear, holding standards that filter rather than repel, and building the kind of depth and presence that simply cannot be replicated by whoever might come along next. These are not flashy qualities. They don't photograph well. They don't fit neatly into a highlight reel. But they are, overwhelmingly, what actually determines whether someone becomes an unforgettable first choice or a forgettable, easily replaced option. The next 5 chapters will build directly on this foundation, moving from the internal and interpersonal work covered so far into the more specific, practical territory of how these principles play out in real situations, real conversations, and real moments of decision. Before moving forward, it's worth sitting with one final idea that ties these first 10 chapters together. Becoming undeniable is not a performance you put on for other people to notice. It is, at its core, a relationship you build with yourself first, one where your own word means something to you, where your own standards are things you actually hold rather than just state, where your own emotional world is something you can navigate with steadiness rather than being thrown around by it. Every principle covered so far, standards, emotional steadiness, secure communication, reading investment accurately, showing up with real presence and depth, flows outward from this single internal relationship. Get that relationship right, and the way other people perceive and treat you shifts as a natural consequence. not because you learned a set of external tactics to perform, but because you actually became someone different. Someone whose worth is no longer up for negotiation. Someone who was never really trying to become someone's first choice at all, but simply became undeniable in the process of finally choosing themselves. Chapter 11. Walking away with grace instead of resentment. There will come a point, if you apply everything covered so far with any real consistency, where you will have to walk away from someone who is not meeting your standards, who is not converting interest into investment, who cannot or will not meet you with the consistency and depth you now recognize you deserve. This chapter is about how to do that, walking away in a way that preserves your dignity, protects your emotional well-being, and, just as importantly, doesn't undo all the internal work you've done by collapsing into bitterness or resentment on your way out the door. The instinct, when someone has consistently failed to meet your standards, is often to want them to understand exactly how much they hurt you, to deliver a final, comprehensive explanation of everything they did wrong, in the hope that this explanation will produce either an apology, a change of heart, or at least an acknowledgement that validates everything you went through. This instinct is understandable, but it rarely produces the outcome you're hoping for. People who were unwilling or unable to meet your needs while you were actively in the relationship are rarely transformed into deeply reflective, accountable partners by a farewell speech, no matter how well-crafted or justified that speech might be. Waiting for that transformation before you allow yourself to walk away only delays your own healing, in service of an outcome that was already unlikely to arrive. Walking away with grace does not mean walking away silently or pretending everything was fine. It means stating clearly, without excessive elaboration, why you're stepping back, and then actually following through on that decision, rather than using the statement as an opening for further negotiation. Something as simple as, "I've realized I need a level of consistency and effort that isn't happening here, and I have to prioritize that for myself," communicates the truth honestly, without descending into an exhaustive account of every specific grievance. The goal is not to make the other person understand the full depth of your experience. That was never guaranteed to happen anyway. And needing it to happen keeps your own closure dependent on someone else's response, which puts you right back in the position of needing something from someone who has already shown they may not be capable of giving it. There is also an important distinction between anger and resentment that matters here. Anger, in the moment of recognizing you've been undervalued, is a completely appropriate and even healthy response. It signals that a boundary was crossed, that something important to you was disregarded, and it can be a genuinely useful source of the energy required to actually follow through on walking away rather than staying stuck in indecision. Resentment is different. Resentment is anger that has calcified, unresolved, carried forward, replayed repeatedly long after the actual situation has ended. Resentment doesn't punish the person who hurt you nearly as effectively as it punishes you, because you are the one carrying it, day after day, long after they've likely moved on with barely a second thought. Allowing yourself to feel the anger fully in the moment, without suppressing it, is actually one of the best ways to prevent it from calcifying into long-term resentment, because emotions that are fully felt tend to move through and resolve, while emotions that are suppressed tend to linger and fester. Grace in walking away also means resisting the urge to seek out information about how the other person is doing after you've left, checking their social media, asking mutual friends for updates, monitoring whether they seem to be struggling or thriving without you. This kind of monitoring keeps you tethered to a situation you've decided to leave. And it almost always produces more pain than clarity. Because whatever you find, whether they seem devastated or completely unaffected, tends to get interpreted in a way that reopens the wound rather than helping it close. Genuinely walking away means also walking away from the habit of checking in on what you left behind. There is one more consideration worth naming here, because it changes how the entire experience gets processed afterward. Walking away from someone who failed to meet your standards is not a failure on your part, even though it can feel that way in the immediate aftermath, especially if you invested significant time, hope, or emotional energy into the relationship. A relationship ending because it didn't meet your genuine needs is not evidence that you asked for too much, or that you're somehow difficult to love, or that you made a mistake by holding your standards. It is evidence that the standards did exactly what they were designed to do: reveal clearly and honestly that this particular connection was not capable of meeting them. That revelation, however painful in the moment, is infinitely more valuable than years spent not knowing, or knowing but refusing to act on what you already sensed. There's a practical question that tends to follow the decision to walk away. What do you do with the grief that follows, even when you know the decision was right? It's worth naming clearly that grief and rightness are not mutually exclusive. You can know with complete certainty that walking away was the correct decision, and still genuinely grieve what you hoped the relationship could have been. This grief is not a sign of doubt or weakness. It is a natural response to loss, even the loss of something that wasn't actually serving you. Allowing yourself to grieve fully, rather than rushing to prove how fine you are or how quickly you've moved on, is part of what allows the grief to actually resolve, rather than lingering unprocessed and quietly shaping how you approach the next relationship that comes along. It also helps to recognize that the discomfort immediately following a difficult decision to walk away is not reliable evidence that the decision was wrong. Almost any significant change, even a genuinely positive one, produces a period of disorientation and discomfort simply because your nervous system has to adjust to the absence of something familiar. Mistaking that adjustment discomfort for proof that you made a mistake is one of the most common reasons people return to relationships they had already correctly decided to leave. Giving yourself permission to feel uncomfortable without immediately interpreting that discomfort as a signal to reverse course is an essential skill for making walking away actually stick. It's also worth addressing directly what to do in the specific, common scenario where the person you walked away from reaches back out after some time has passed, expressing regret, promising change, asking for another chance. These moments are genuinely difficult because they often arrive precisely when the initial pain of the separation has started to ease, and the temptation to reopen the door can feel overwhelming, especially if real affection remained underneath the decision to leave. The question worth asking in this moment is not whether you still have feelings. Feelings rarely disappear just because a relationship ended, but whether anything has actually demonstrably changed beyond words. Promises made in the immediate aftermath of loss are notoriously unreliable predictors of sustained behavioral change, because they're often driven by the temporary discomfort of losing you rather than by genuine, internalized growth. If you do choose to consider reopening a door you closed, the same standards that led you to close it in the first place still apply, and they should be held with the same seriousness, evaluated through sustained behavior over time. rather than through the emotional intensity of a heartfelt apology delivered in a single moment. Chapter 12. Being chosen from the very beginning. Everything discussed so far has largely focused on shifting existing patterns within relationships that are already underway, but there is enormous value in understanding how these same principles apply from the very first interactions with someone new, because the earlier stages of any relationship set a template that becomes remarkably difficult to renegotiate later. The dynamic you establish in the first few weeks or months of knowing someone tends to become the baseline that both people unconsciously return to, which means getting this stage right saves you from having to do painful, difficult renegotiation years down the line. The most common mistake people make in the early stages of a new connection is front-loading their investment, making themselves maximally available, maximally accommodating, and maximally enthusiastic before there has been any real opportunity to observe whether the other person is actually matching that energy. This happens because early excitement feels good, and sharing that excitement feels natural and honest. But there's a difference between expressing genuine enthusiasm and abandoning all discernment about whether that enthusiasm is actually being reciprocated with matching effort. Pacing your investment to mirror, roughly, the investment you're receiving in return is not about playing games or being calculating for its own sake. It's about giving yourself enough time to actually gather accurate information about who this person is and how they treat you, before you've already emotionally committed far beyond what the actual evidence supports. This pacing matters because the early stages of any connection are, whether people like to admit it or not, an audition period, one that goes in both directions simultaneously. You are learning about them, and they are learning about you, and what they are learning, whether you intend it or not, includes exactly how much effort is required to secure your time, attention, and affection. If the answer, from the very beginning, is none at all, if you are fully available, fully enthusiastic, and fully invested, regardless of what they're offering in return, you have taught them, in the very first weeks, that your presence doesn't need to be earned. Reversing that lesson later, after months of reinforcing it, is exponentially harder than simply establishing a more balanced dynamic from the start. Being chosen from the beginning also requires resisting the urge to make yourself endlessly convenient during this early stage. This might look like always being available whenever they reach out, regardless of your own existing plans or priorities, rearranging your schedule to accommodate last-minute invitations, or simply making it clear, through your behavior, that you have nothing else going on that could possibly compete with spending time with them. While this might feel like a way to demonstrate how much you want to be around them, it actually removes the very friction that makes people value what they have to work to obtain. A life that already has structure, momentum, and other commitments. One where spending time with someone new requires them to actually fit into your existing life rather than simply filling whatever space happens to be empty. Communicates something powerful without you ever having to say a word. This person has a full life, and being part of it is something worth making an effort for. None of this is about deliberately being difficult to reach or manufacturing unavailability as a strategy. It is about not artificially clearing your schedule and abandoning your existing priorities the moment someone new shows interest, which is a temptation almost everyone experiences in the early exciting stages of a new connection. The people who end up being genuinely chosen rather than simply enjoyed for a while and then deprioritized once the initial excitement fades, are consistently the ones who maintained their own life, their own standards, and their own pace throughout the early stages, rather than dissolving entirely into the excitement of being wanted by someone new. There is a particularly useful practice worth adopting during this early stage: observing what someone does without being asked. Anyone can respond well to a direct request, showing up on time when a specific time has been agreed upon, replying when directly asked a question. What reveals far more about someone's genuine character and investment is what they do when nothing has been explicitly requested, whether they think to check in after mentioning something stressful was happening in your life, whether they remember small details from earlier conversations without needing to be reminded, whether they make an effort to include you in plans without being prompted first. These unprompted behaviors are far harder to fake and far more revealing than anything someone says directly about their intentions, and paying close attention to them during the early stages gives you significantly more accurate information than simply taking someone's stated interest at face value. There is also real value in resisting the urge to define the relationship prematurely, before enough time has actually passed to gather genuine information. Early excitement often creates pressure to quickly establish exactly what this is, to seek reassurance and labels before the actual behavior over time has had a chance to speak for itself. While clarity is genuinely important, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to know where things stand, seeking that clarity too early, before there's been sufficient time to observe consistent patterns, often means basing significant decisions on very limited information. Allowing a reasonable amount of time to pass, watching how someone behaves across a range of circumstances, ordinary days and stressful ones, easy moments and inconvenient ones, gives you a far more reliable foundation for any conversation about where things stand than jumping to that conversation the moment enough enthusiasm has been expressed to make it feel warranted. It's also worth naming one final piece of this early stage dynamic: how you handle the moments when the other person does something that falls short of your standards, even in these first few weeks. Many people, eager not to seem overly critical or difficult this early on, let small red flags pass without comment, telling themselves it's too soon to make a big deal out of something minor. But small inconsistencies in the earlier stages are rarely actually minor. They are often the clearest, least defended version of someone's true patterns, before they've learned exactly what you will and won't accept. Addressing a small concern early, calmly, and without drama does two valuable things at once. It gives the other person accurate information about your standards before those standards have to compete with months of accumulated attachment, and it gives you valuable information about whether they're actually capable of receiving that kind of honest feedback without becoming defensive or withdrawing. Both pieces of information are far more useful gathered early than gathered late. Chapter 13. Staying chosen. Avoiding the complacency trap. There is a particular irony that plays out in long-term relationships, one that explains why so many connections that start out balanced and exciting eventually drift into the same dynamic of one person becoming an option rather than a priority. It is the trap of complacency, the gradual, almost invisible process by which the effort, attentiveness, and intentionality that characterize the early stages of a relationship slowly erode over time, replaced by the assumption that because the relationship has lasted this long, it will simply continue lasting without any ongoing investment required. This erosion rarely happens through a single dramatic event. It happens through 1,000 small omissions. The compliment that used to be offered freely, but now goes unsaid, because it's assumed to already be understood. The effort to plan something thoughtful that used to happen regularly, but now happens rarely, because the relationship feels secure enough not to require it. The curiosity about the other person's day, their thoughts, their inner world, that used to feel endlessly interesting, but now gets replaced by routine, surface-level exchanges, because familiarity has replaced genuine engagement. None of these individual omissions feels significant in isolation, but their cumulative effect over months and years is the same erosion of value that this entire audiobook has been describing, just happening slowly enough that it's easy to miss until the damage is substantial. Avoiding this trap requires actively working against a deeply ingrained psychological tendency: the human brain's habituation to anything that becomes consistent and predictable. This is the same mechanism that makes background noise fade from conscious awareness after enough exposure. And it applies to relationships just as powerfully as it applies to sound or scent. A partner who was once a source of active fascination gradually becomes background, not because they've become less valuable, but because the brain has stopped actively registering their presence as something requiring conscious attention. Countering this requires deliberate effort to keep noticing, keep engaging, keep treating the relationship as something that requires ongoing investment rather than something that, once established, runs on autopilot. One of the most effective ways to counteract this habituation is to deliberately introduce novelty and genuine curiosity back into a long-term connection. This does not require grand romantic gestures or constant excitement. That expectation is unrealistic and exhausting to sustain. It requires smaller, more sustainable practices. Asking genuine questions about how the other person's inner world has been evolving, rather than assuming you already know everything there is to know about them because you've known them for years. Making space for new shared experiences, rather than always defaulting to the same familiar routines. Actively expressing appreciation for specific things the other person does, rather than assuming appreciation is understood simply because it's no longer stated. These practices interrupt the habituation process, keeping the relationship in a state of active engagement rather than passive assumption. There is also a critical mindset shift required to avoid complacency long-term, recognizing that security in a relationship should never be confused with entitlement to that relationship's continuation without ongoing effort. Security means trusting that the relationship has a strong foundation, built through consistent, demonstrated care over time. Entitlement means believing that foundation exempts you from continuing to build on it. These are easy to confuse because they can feel similar from the inside. Both produce a sense of relaxed confidence about the relationship's stability, but the difference in how they play out over time is enormous. Security, properly understood, includes an ongoing commitment to continuing the behaviors that built the security in the first place. Entitlement quietly abandons those behaviors, assuming the foundation will hold indefinitely regardless of whether it's maintained, and it is precisely this quiet abandonment that turns former priorities back into options. Even in relationships that once felt completely secure, it's worth noting that complacency rarely affects both people in a relationship equally at the same time, which is exactly what makes it so dangerous. Often one person begins to notice the erosion long before the other, feeling increasingly unseen or undervalued, while the other person remains genuinely unaware that anything has shifted. assuming that the absence of complaints means the absence of problems. This is why proactively checking in on the health of a long-term relationship, rather than waiting for one person to reach a breaking point before raising concerns, is such a valuable practice. Regularly and explicitly asking whether both people still feel prioritized, still feel seen, still feel like active participants in a relationship that requires ongoing investment, catches the early signs of complacency long before they calcify into the kind of resentment that becomes far more difficult to repair. It's also worth naming that combating complacency is not solely an individual responsibility within a relationship. It requires both people engaging in this ongoing effort for it to actually work. One person cannot single-handedly sustain a relationship's sense of active engagement indefinitely, while the other coasts on autopilot, at least not without the same imbalance and eventual resentment that this entire audiobook has described throughout emerging in a different form. If you find yourself doing all the work of noticing complacency, addressing it, and reinvesting energy into keeping the relationship alive, while your effort is met with continued passivity from the other person, that pattern itself is important information, one that connects directly back to the earlier chapters on reading investment, rather than interest, and on holding standards that filter, rather than repel. There's also a distinct kind of complacency worth naming that shows up specifically in relationships that have weathered real difficulty together. Hardship, loss, major life transitions. Having survived something hard together can create a powerful sense of bond and loyalty, and rightly so. Shared hardship genuinely does deepen relationships in meaningful ways. But this sense of having proven the relationship's strength through crisis can also become a subtle justification for coasting afterward. The unspoken belief that having already demonstrated commitment during the hard times exempts the relationship from needing ongoing effort during the ordinary ones. Surviving hardship together and actively nurturing a relationship day to day are not the same accomplishment, and mistaking one for the other is a particularly common and particularly hard to notice version of the complacency trap. Chapter 14. Undeniable Beyond Romance, Friendships and Professional Life. While much of this audiobook has focused on romantic dynamics, because that context tends to make these patterns most emotionally visible, every principle covered so far applies with equal force to friendships, family relationships, and professional life. The same psychology that determines whether you become someone's first choice in a romantic context determines whether you become the friend someone actually prioritizes, the colleague whose input is genuinely sought after, the family member whose presence is valued rather than assumed. Understanding how these dynamics extend beyond romance gives you a far more complete picture of how to build a life where you are consistently chosen, valued, and prioritized across every domain that matters to you. In friendships, the pattern of becoming someone's option rather than their priority often shows up as being the friend who is always available to listen, always willing to show up, always the one reaching out to maintain the connection, while receiving noticeably less reciprocity in return. This pattern is often harder to recognize in friendships than in romantic relationships, because friendship is culturally framed as something that shouldn't require the same kind of boundary setting or standard holding that romantic relationships do. But the same underlying psychology applies. A friendship where one person consistently gives more than they receive is not a healthy, balanced friendship, simply because it's platonic rather than romantic. It's an imbalanced dynamic that will produce the same resentment and eventual burnout that imbalanced romantic relationships produce, just on a longer, quieter timeline. Applying the principles from this audiobook to friendship means being willing to notice when you're consistently the one initiating plans, checking in during difficult times, and offering support without receiving comparable investment in return, and being willing to actually let that imbalance inform how much energy you continue to invest, rather than continuing indefinitely out of loyalty to the history of the friendship alone. It means expressing your needs clearly to friends, rather than assuming that genuine closeness means never having to state what you need explicitly. And it means recognizing that some of the most valuable friendships you'll ever have are ones where you don't have to perform constant availability in order to maintain the connection, friendships resilient enough to survive natural ebbs and flows in contact, rather than requiring constant maintenance in order to feel secure. In professional contexts, these same dynamics determine whether you become someone whose contributions are genuinely valued and sought after, or someone whose labor gets quietly absorbed without recognition or advancement. The colleague who says yes to every request, who never pushes back on unreasonable deadlines, who consistently takes on additional work without ever advocating for their own priorities, often becomes exactly the kind of guaranteed, no-cost resource that this audiobook has described throughout. Valuable in the sense of being useful, but not valued in the sense of being genuinely prioritized when it comes to recognition, advancement, or respect. The colleague who maintains clear boundaries around their time and capacity, who says no when a request genuinely doesn't align with their priorities, and who advocates clearly for their own contributions, tends to be perceived somewhat counterintuitively to those who haven't internalized this psychology as more valuable, not less, precisely because their time and effort have been demonstrated to have actual limits and actual cost. This is not an argument for becoming uncooperative or difficult to work with in professional settings. Cooperation and generosity remain genuinely valuable professional qualities. It is an argument for applying the same underlying principle that has run throughout this entire audiobook. Unconditional, unlimited availability in any context, romantic, platonic, professional, or familial, tends to be perceived as having correspondingly unlimited and therefore low value, while availability that is genuine but bounded, generous but not limitless, tends to be perceived as significantly more valuable, precisely because its limits make clear that receiving it required something real. Family relationships deserve specific mention here as well, because they present a particularly difficult version of this challenge. Unlike friendships or romantic relationships, family relationships often carry deep-rooted expectations, sometimes explicit and sometimes entirely unspoken, that availability should be unconditional regardless of how it's reciprocated. Simply because of the family bond itself, this makes applying boundaries in family contexts especially difficult and often especially fraught with guilt. But the underlying psychology doesn't change simply because the relationship is one you didn't choose. Family members who consistently take your availability for granted without reciprocating consideration or respect are not exempt from the same dynamics that apply everywhere else, and continuing to offer unconditional accommodation in family relationships that don't reciprocate it tends to produce the same slow erosion of self-respect that it produces in every other context, even when it's wrapped in the language of familial obligation. None of this is to suggest walking away from family is always the right or even a realistic response. Family relationships carry complexity, history, and interdependence that make wholesale withdrawal a genuinely different proposition than ending a romantic relationship or drifting from a friendship. But within those complexities, there is still real room for smaller, meaningful boundaries. Choosing not to be endlessly available for last-minute demands. Speaking up when a pattern of being taken for granted has become clear. Protecting your own time and energy, even within relationships you can't or don't want to fully walk away from. Applying these principles to family doesn't require dramatic rupture. It requires the same clear-eyed honesty about patterns and consequences that has run through every other chapter of this audiobook, adapted to a context where the stakes and history are simply different. There's a broader principle worth drawing out from this chapter's exploration across friendships, professional life, and family. One that ties directly back into everything covered earlier in this audiobook. The specific relationship type changes the details, but never the underlying mechanism. Whether it's a romantic partner, a friend, a colleague, or a family member, human beings consistently assign more value to relationships and resources that require genuine effort to maintain and consistently take for granted whatever comes without cost or limit. This is not a flaw specific to any one type of relationship or any particular kind of person. It's a consistent feature of how human perception and value assignment work across essentially every domain of life. Once you truly internalize this single mechanism, you no longer need a separate set of rules for romance, for friendship, for work, and for family. You simply need to recognize the pattern wherever it shows up and apply the same core principle: genuine, bounded value, freely given but never unconditional, consistently outperforms unlimited, unconditional availability in producing relationships where you are actually prioritized rather than merely tolerated. Chapter 15. The final shift. Becoming someone who never has to chase again. Everything covered throughout this audiobook. The psychology of scarcity. The difference between being wanted and being chosen. The necessity of internally generated self-worth. The power of emotional steadiness. The importance of communicating from security. The skill of reading investment rather than interest. And the application of all of this across romantic, platonic, and professional relationships ultimately points toward a single, unified shift in how you move through the world. This final chapter is about integrating everything that has come before into a coherent, lasting way of being, one that doesn't require constant conscious effort to maintain because it has become simply who you are, rather than a technique you're actively applying. The person who has genuinely internalized everything covered in this audiobook does not think in terms of strategies for becoming someone's first choice. They have simply become someone whose life, standards, and sense of self make them naturally difficult to overlook. Not through calculation, but through the accumulated result of genuinely valuing themselves and consistently acting in alignment with that value. This distinction matters enormously, because techniques applied without genuine internal change tend to be fragile. They hold up under easy conditions, but collapse the moment real pressure is applied. When someone genuinely compelling comes along and tempts you back into old patterns of overgiving. When loneliness makes lowering your standards feel temporarily worth it. When the discomfort of holding a boundary starts to feel unbearable. Genuine internal change, the kind built through the sustained practice described throughout this audiobook, holds up under exactly these conditions because it isn't a performance being maintained through willpower. It's simply an accurate reflection of who you've become. Reaching this point, where these principles no longer require conscious effort because they've become your default way of operating, takes time, and it's worth being honest about that, rather than promising instant transformation. The habits of overgiving, of seeking external validation, of confusing interest with investment, of communicating from fear rather than security, were likely built over years, sometimes decades, and unwinding them thoroughly enough that new patterns become automatic realistically takes sustained practice over months, sometimes longer. This is not a discouraging fact. It's simply an honest one, and understanding it protects you from the common trap of trying these principles for a few weeks, not seeing an immediate transformation in how everyone around you treats you, and concluding that the approach doesn't work. Real change, the kind that produces lasting results rather than temporary tactics, is built slowly, through repeated practice, through inevitable setbacks that get corrected rather than treated as proof of failure, and through the gradual accumulation of evidence, first to yourself and eventually to everyone around you, that you have genuinely become someone who no longer needs to chase, perform, or overgive in order to feel worthy of being chosen. There is a specific internal marker that tends to signal you've genuinely arrived at this shift, rather than still performing it consciously. It is the moment when the thought of someone losing interest, pulling away, or choosing not to prioritize you no longer triggers panic, desperation, or a scramble to win back their attention through increased effort, but instead triggers a calm, grounded response. Disappointment, perhaps. Hurt, perhaps. Both are still allowed, but not the collapse of your entire sense of security. This is not coldness. It is the natural result of having done the deep, unglamorous work this audiobook has walked through, chapter by chapter, of building a self that doesn't require anyone else's validation in order to feel complete. It is worth acknowledging, honestly, that this journey doesn't end in some permanent, unshakable state where old patterns never resurface again. Even people who have genuinely internalized everything covered here will occasionally feel the old pull toward overgiving, toward seeking premature reassurance, toward tolerating something they know deep down doesn't meet their standards. Particularly during moments of loneliness, stress, or genuine attraction to someone who happens to trigger old wounds. The difference is not that these pulls disappear entirely. The difference is that you now have the awareness to notice them when they arise, and the accumulated practice to interrupt them far more quickly than you once could, before they have the chance to fully take hold and undo months or years of genuine growth. This is what mastery of these principles actually looks like in practice. Not perfection, but quick recognition and quick correction. As you move forward from here, the invitation is not to try to remember and apply every single principle covered in this audiobook consciously. In every interaction, that would be exhausting and ultimately counterproductive. The invitation is to return to the ideas that resonated most strongly, the ones that named a pattern you recognized in your own life with particular clarity, and to practice those specific shifts deliberately, allowing the broader transformation to build gradually from that focused practice, rather than trying to overhaul everything about how you relate to other people all at once. Choose one pattern, notice it, interrupt it deliberately the next time it shows up. Repeat that process consistently, and over time, without needing to force it, you will find that the entire framework covered throughout this audiobook has become woven into how you naturally show up, not as a set of rules you're following, but as an accurate reflection of a person who has finally, genuinely, stopped being everyone's option and become quietly, and without needing to chase it, someone's undeniable first choice. If there's a single thread to hold on to as you close this audiobook and return to your own life, let it be this. Nothing covered across these 15 chapters was ever really about changing other people's behavior. Every principle, from raising your standards to communicating from security to building genuine abundance, was ultimately about changing your relationship with yourself first, trusting that when that internal relationship is solid, the external world tends to respond accordingly. Not because you've learned to manipulate outcomes, but because you've become someone whose presence genuinely reflects the value you've spent this entire process learning to recognize in yourself. That recognition, more than any specific tactic or technique, is what makes someone undeniable. And it's available to you the moment you decide to stop waiting for someone else to grant it to you and start extending it to yourself instead. There is a final, practical thought worth carrying forward from here. The people who benefit most from everything covered in this audiobook are not the ones who listen once and expect permanent transformation. They are the ones who return to specific chapters when old patterns resurface, who treat this less as a one-time lesson and more as a reference they revisit during the moments when clarity is hardest to hold on to, during a confusing situationship, during the early excitement of someone new, during the quiet complacency of a long relationship that started to drift. Growth in this area is rarely linear, and giving yourself permission to need reminding, without treating that need as evidence of failure, is itself one of the quieter forms of self-respect this entire audiobook has been trying to teach. You are not meant to arrive at some finished, permanent state of being undeniable and never think about any of this again. You are meant to keep choosing it, deliberately, again and again, until choosing it stops requiring deliberate effort at all, and simply becomes who you are.